Hi, everybody. My name is Brian. I'm a fourth-year synthetic organic chemistry PhD student at UC Berkeley. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the Federal Select Agent Program. I'll start off with a brief history of the program, followed by an overview of kind of what the program is and what its requirements are for entities that want to use select agents, and then finally some criticisms and recent reviews of the program. So the history of the Federal Select Agent Program begins in 1995 when an individual named Larry Wayne Harris was arrested for the order of Yersinia pestis, which is the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. And he ordered this to his home.
Bad ideas.
Yeah, ended up being a bad idea for him. So Larry Wayne Harris, who's pictured on left here, was a microbiologist and also a white supremacist, being a former member of the Aryan Nations. And on May 5th, he decided to order 3 vials of Yersinia pestis from the American Type Culture Collection, which at the time was the world's largest distributor of microorganisms. Larry got a little bit impatient with his order, and so just 5 days later, he calls the ATCC to ask them exactly what's taking so long with his order. Larry was a very eccentric individual and had a propensity to talk himself into trouble. So the person on the other end of the call at the ATCC gets a little suspicious that Larry doesn't really know as much about Yersinia pestis as he probably should. So that person calls the CDC. CDC officials and law enforcement end up on Larry's front door. And when they find Larry there, he tells them that he needed to buy these vials because he wanted to work on an antidote to the plague, even though several treatments already existed at the time. And he specifically tells one CDC official that he needed to counteract an imminent invasion from Iraq of super germ-carrying rats. Nobody's sure exactly where he got that idea from, but the kind of upshot of the story is that he was convicted eventually only of mail and wire fraud because he misled the American Type Culture Collection as to why he wanted to buy these vials. He used his employer's lab permit number to register an account with the ATCC, even though it was going directly to his home address. And people discovered that at the time there were no federal domestic restrictions on transportation or possession of human pathogens. So he was only able to be convicted on mail and wire fraud. Just to give you a good sense of what else was happening at the time, remember Larry's incident was in May of 1995, and just a few weeks prior there were other incidents around the world. On March 20th, a Japanese cult named Shinrikyo released sarin gas in the Tokyo subway, and on April 19th there was the Oklahoma City bombing. So there were several incidents just within weeks of each other that had something to do with terrorism, and so terrorism was kind of on everybody's minds at the time. And so in 1996, Congress passed the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, and one of the sections in that act was specifically kind of in response to the incident with Larry. So specifically, that section of this legislation required the Secretary of Health and Human Services to establish a list of biological agents that had the potential to pose a severe threat to public health and safety. And so this is kind of the first iteration of what we call now the select agent list. At the time, the only thing that was regulated was the transfer of these agents, not the use or possession. And remember, this is at a time when everybody is worried about terrorism, and so people were mostly worried about having these agents end up in the wrong hands. So the next kind of major events that caused changes in how we regulate select agents were in 2001 and 2002. Of course, in 2001, there were the Anthrax attacks, and then in both 2001 and 2002, there were subsequent pieces of legislation. So I'm not going to go into the Anthrax attacks all that much because it's a more well-known phenomenon, but it killed 5, caused illness in 17 others, caused fear and panic worldwide. But the follow-up legislation, this included the USA Patriot Act of 2001 and the Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Act of 2002, ended up significantly expanding the oversight of biological select agents and toxins, which hereafter will be abbreviated BSATs. And in addition to regulating the transfer of these select agents, the use and possession were now also regulated. So if you wanted to use select agents for any purpose, you would have to register with the Select Agent Program, which was formally created after these pieces of legislation were passed. And if you possessed a select agent, that would be a crime unless you had registered previously. in addition to agents that affect humans, also included was oversight of animal and plant agents, and these would be regulated by the USDA. So the last kind of major changes to the Federal Select Agent Program occurred in 2010 and 2012. So in 2010, Obama signed this executive order titled Optimizing the Security of Select Agents in the US. And in 2012, basically what that executive order said was carried out. So this executive order signed by Obama in 2010 directed HHS and USDA to designate a set of Tier 1 agents, and this would be a subset of the larger select agent list that was chosen because it posed particularly high risk of misuse. And the select agent regulations were revised, and the executive order directed these agencies to revise the select agent regulations to establish higher physical security standards for these Tier 1 agents. And in 2012, basically this executive order was followed up on. We have a set of Tier 1 agents now, and they have higher physical security standards for their use. Okay, so now I'm going to go through kind of what the Select Agent Program is and what its requirements are. So firstly, it's jointly managed by the CDC and the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS. So the CDC manages and regulates those select agents that are relevant for human health, and APHIS, which is under the USDA, regulates those that are relevant for animal and plant health. Currently, it's cut off here, but the list of select agents is 66 long, and 14 of those are Tier 1. And so I've just included a list of kind of notable examples on there. And this list is reviewed every other year. So I think to get a good sense of what is required by the Select Agent Program, it's good to kind of take the perspective of somebody that is wanting to use select agents and kind of think through what kind of hoops they need to jump through in order to start using select agents legally. So the first thing they have to do is register with the Select Agent Program. So they have to fill out this form, which is not a trivial thing at all. If you actually look at the form online, the instructions for the form itself themselves are 148 pages long. So it's not a trivial thing to go through, and that's because there are lots of things that are required for registration. So 3 of the things that are required are security plans for security, safety, and incident response. So for your security plan, you have to describe procedures for physical security. So this means how are you going to secure your select agent physically? How are you going to prevent theft? This might include things like surveillance systems, key card access for rooms where you hold select agents, perimeter fencing, things like that. You have to describe procedures for inventory control. So basically, how are you going to keep track of your select agents? How many files do you have? Where are you going to keep this information? And then also information systems control. How are you going to keep your computer network safe such that hackers can't manipulate your physical security systems? You also need to have procedures for removing suspicious people and procedures for properly shipping, receiving, and storing select agents. In general, for Tier 1 agents, there are higher standards. And one of the higher standards specifically for your security plan is that if you have individuals that are, any individual that has access to Tier 1 agents has to undergo a personnel suitability assessment, which is basically just assessing, are you a responsible, trustworthy, emotionally stable person, and the entity is required to, none of these I think are specifically required, but things that are suggested are things like checking criminal history, work history, having the individual undergo drug testing, etc. And this assessment should be done both before the individual has access to the Tier 1 agents and also on an ongoing basis. Entities must also submit a safety plan that should describe the risks associated with each select agent, as well as any safeguards that are in place to protect to keep the select agents contained, such that entity personnel, the public, and the environment aren't accidentally exposed to these agents. And the safety plan should also describe procedures for disinfection, decontamination, and destruction of contaminated materials. And they also provide reference to these other publications, which I think are much more in-depth in terms of how a good safety plan should look. And then then finally, you have to submit an incident response plan as well. And so this is basically a plan in response to any kind of emergencies, things like theft, loss, or release of a select agent. And just to note here, release basically, it can be as seemingly minor as just like a needle prick or an animal bite. It doesn't have to be like releasing infected animals into the world or anything like that. But even seemingly minor incidents have to be reported. Any theft, loss, or release of select agents have to be reported to the CDC and or APHIS. But also things like security breaches, natural disasters, bomb threats, suspicious packages, fires, gas leaks, explosions, power outages. You should have plans for all of these. And in those plans, you should have procedures for emergency evacuation and decontamination. Each of these plans has to be reviewed annually and be revised as necessary. And you should also perform and document drills that are basically testing these plans to make sure they're effective. So you'd be doing things like simulating a break-in or simulating a natural disaster. What are people's roles? How are people responding to those simulations? So some additional registration requirements include designating a responsible official who's in charge of ensuring compliance with these select agent regulations, and making sure that, and you also have to, each individual with access to select agents has to pass a security risk assessment by the FBI. And they're basically checking for these three things. Have you committed a crime punishable by imprisonment for greater than 1 year? Do you have mental illness? And do you have ties to a terrorist organization? Okay, so how does the select agent program kind of make sure that you're in compliance? This mostly happens through inspections. So inspections occur first on initial registration. Inspectors will come down to your organization and check things out, make sure you have adequate security and safety measures in place. Upon renewal of registration, which has to be done every 3 years, and also generally they plan to come once in between every renewal of registration. So generally, you have to expect these inspectors to arrive about every 1.5 years. As well as after any sort of incident is reported, they also come and check things out. The inspections can be either announced or unannounced, and the inspectors come in and kind of look at your security and safety measures and follow up their inspections with an inspection report, basically telling you kind of what things need to be improved on and how you can do so. These inspections can range in terms of how long they take and how kind of involved the process is. For small labs, it might only take 1 to 2 inspectors and 1 day on site. For larger labs, it can take up to 10 inspectors for a couple of weeks on site, which seems like a pretty rigorous kind of inspection process. What are the enforcement mechanisms for noncompliance? There are a few options. First, and I guess the most minor, I guess, is entity participation in a corrective action plan. So basically, this is the select agent program working with the entity to make sure that if they had just had an incident, that incident doesn't happen again, and that they fall in compliance with the select agent regulations. The entity's registration can be suspended or revoked. The entity can be referred to either of these investigative bodies for investigation with possible civil penalties, and they can also be referred to the FBI for investigation with possible criminal penalties in the worst cases. We can point to possibly some successes of the select agent program, and certainly on the select agent program website, they tout kind of these successes. Since 2003, there have been no confirmed thefts of a select agent from a registered entity, no deaths among lab workers as a result of working with select agents, and also no reported cases of illness in the general public or death in the general public due to work with select agents in regulated labs. So this is all fine and good, but this A+ that I put here is kind of tongue-in-cheek, because as you know, as you may know, there have been several kind of high-profile incidents that happened in registered labs in the past few years. So kind of the first incident that kind of set this whole deluge off was in May 2014 when a CDC lab accidentally sent H5N1 flu strain to an unexpected USDA lab. Just a month later, a CDC lab accidentally sends live anthrax bacteria to unequipped labs. Another month later, smallpox virus vials from the 50s were discovered on an NIH campus. In December, the CDC accidentally sends live Ebola virus to unequipped labs. It keeps 2015, the DoD lab was discovered to have inadvertently shipped live anthrax bacteria to nearly 200 other labs worldwide over 12 years. That seems really scary to me. And in November 2016, the Department of Homeland Security discovered that ricin had inadvertently been sent to a training center multiple times since 2011. So, this is only over the course of 2 years, and of course, this got into the media, and everybody was paying attention to this at the time. And so, these incidents were followed up by a number of reviews of the Select Agent program. Not all of these were specifically focused on the Select Agent program, but all these touched on it at least to some extent. So I'm just going to kind of go through some consolidated criticisms of these from these reviews, just kind of things that I found in common across all the reviews. And the first is that there were lots of people thought that the Select Agent program was very burdensome to comply with. Financial and administrative costs could result in researchers working with researchers that could have worked with Select Agents deciding to work with non-Select Agents instead, or in possibly worst case scenario, drive them to other countries that have less regulatory requirements than the US, which has, I think, one of the more stringent sets of requirements. And one of the reports noted concretely, as one concrete example, that several manufacturers had decided to stop producing veterinary vaccines or diagnostics, in part due to rising costs of compliance with the Select Agent regulations. So that's, I think, just a good example of, a very good concrete example of one of the downsides of these costs of compliance. Second is that inspections don't always target the highest risk activities. People kind of complained that inspectors spend too much time assessing compliance with inventory controls, even though if you're kind of savvy intruder, you could basically just take a small amount of some sort of Select Agent and then replicate it on your own, and so the theft might just be undetectable anyways. Inventory controls are basically counting the number of vials, but the number of vials might not change, right? And so that could be, that doesn't seem like something that there should be that much emphasis on. And then also inspections might be too focused on biological security concerns, even though all the high-profile kind of recent incidents that I pointed out were related to safety concerns rather than security concerns, right? None of those were instances of theft or anything like that. There was often a lack of consistency in inspections, so between inspection visits or even between different inspectors within a single inspection visit, different inspectors had different interpretations of the regulatory requirements that the entities had to follow, and of course this makes it difficult for the entities to know what to expect and how to kind of prepare for the inspections. There are often severe delays in receiving inspection reports. So the Select Agent program kind of sets as a target for itself to get inspection reports back to the entities within 30 days of inspection, but over a quarter of the reports that were issued were given back past the 30-day target. And of course this is bad because entities can't take corrective actions in as timely a fashion as we would like. There were also concerns about a lack of transparency. Any incidents that were reported to the Select Agent program, corrective actions, and punitive measures were only known to the inspected entities themselves. Not even other registered entities necessarily knew about these. And this, of course, prevents other entities from learning from mistakes that one particular entity made. In addition, lack of transparency can decrease trust from the public. There were some media pieces that suggested that the Select Agent program was a very secretive program that kind of shielded the worst violators from public exposure and public criticism. And so that was kind of a common perception of the program as well. One of, I think, perhaps one of the most relevant for kind of global catastrophic biological risk concerns is the fact that there remain several gaps in the Select Agent regulations and what they cover. So rapid changes in biotechnology have now increased the capacity of individuals to synthesize biological agents de novo, and this, of course, reduces the relevance of kind of protecting stores of Select Agents that are at registered entities. It doesn't matter if you have the most secure Select Agents in the world, if somebody else can kind of just synthesize the Select Agent by themselves in their home or in a non-registered lab, then this becomes less the Select Agent program kind of becomes less protective of a program. And in addition, the Select Agent regulations focus on securing physical pathogens, but there's not as much of an emphasis on securing kind of the digital information that would, if proliferated, allow for individuals to synthesize select agents on their own. The select agent program, of course, has responded to all these criticisms and are aware of all these recent reviews and have worked on several different issues. So, for example, they've started releasing an annual report to address transparency concerns. These have statistics on number of incidents, number of registered entities, things like that. They've established an online forum for entities to communicate best practices with each other. So this addresses the concern that entities don't know about incidents at other entities. And they've also published categories of violations with the expected enforcement measures on the website, so entities can kind of know what to expect from an inspection. So this is all fine and good, but I don't think any of these actions have kind of addressed the last kind of category of criticisms that I put up there, the gaps in the select agent regulations. And so as a result, and this is kind of a bit of editorializing on my behalf, but I think the current regulatory regime might be outdated and perhaps not flexible enough to adapt to the changing biotechnological landscape. And in particular, the Blue Ribbon Study Panel on Biodefense calls for a comprehensive assessment and overhaul of the select agent program and thinks it should focus less on whether we can secure stocks of pathogens and more about whether we can control the proliferation of information, predict the nature of the changing biological threat, and ingrain a culture of security awareness within the biomedical community. So just to conclude, the select agent program was established amid concerns of terrorism following incidents in 1995 with Larry Wynn Harris and 2001 with the Anthrax attacks. As a result, the mission of the select agent program is to secure stocks of pathogens at registered entities, because that's the best way to prevent kind of terrorists from getting their hands on select agents. As one notable success, no illnesses or deaths have occurred since 2003 as a result of work with select agents, although there have been several recent high-profile scares. One thing I should have mentioned is, even with all those accidentally sent live Ebola virus or live anthrax virus, all those incidents, none of those led to any human illness. But we can't say if that was, that could have just been a stroke of good luck, right? We'd rather live in a world where those kinds of things don't happen on a regular basis. And of course, the select agent program is responding to some of the criticism engendered by these high-profile incidents, but questions remain as to whether a radically different paradigm focusing on kind of the new emerging threats moving forward. And so these are some of my references, and I'd be happy to take questions.
In terms of those incidents you mentioned, like, do you have a better sense of how they happened? Like, was it just like, lol, wrong address?
Well, so I think the address, like, they intended to send the files to these places, but for the most part, when they were sending like live virus, they thought they were sending inactivated virus, and the receivers were expecting inactivated virus as well. A lot of the times, it was just like two vials that looked the same, and the person thought they knew which one was which, but they mixed them up and just sent the wrong one.
So it's sort of like insufficiently clear inventory at the site that was sending it.
Right. And maybe like a good safety plan would say like, oh, you have to label all the vials that have, a select agent in them.
Reasonable.
Yep.
What kinds of things do we use select agents for? It mentioned veterinary vaccines and diagnostics. What else? And also, actually, that's confusing to me. Why do we? They seem like human diseases.
Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, I don't have a good sense for that either. I don't know if anybody else has any sense of that.
I would assume that for vaccines, you would be getting like either attenuated or basically you would be getting viruses that you hope are not pathogenic. But if you're doing vaccine development, that could be a case where you're working with viruses that could be dangerous.
Like for veterinary ones, particular, like bird flu, probably.
Perhaps. But there are viruses that infect proteins and various animals. So.
Yep.
I was wondering
So are you talking about the terrorist attacks or the kind of just the accidental sending?
Like any of those, like what's the response for when something like that happens, and how much do we actually have in terms of like potential anti-poison treatments or things like that?
Right. I know there is a federal stockpile, and I think the CDC coordinates kind of the distribution of the federal stockpile of, I don't exactly know what they keep in the stockpile, like vaccines and what kinds of diseases. But I know that such a stockpile exists. But I think there have been like criticisms of the stockpile not really being enough for like a major outbreak, and distribution is, it's hard to coordinate distributing to any like local entity that needs to get their hands on some sort of vaccine or therapeutic, and so that process can also be slower than we'd like. Yeah.
Those the wave of CDC and mishaps from 2014 to 2016. Do you know if that prompted any sort of external or internal review of the CDC? Because I noticed most of them were the CDC, and their shipping out their shipping process, I guess. And also, do you know if it caused the FSAP to change any of their guidelines around specifically things like safety and mishaps, like not security related things, but just the sort of accidents that can happen from that sort of thing? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the CDC did do a 90-day internal review,
Okay.
and that's one of the reports.
Cool.
Although honestly, I looked into it; it was like 4 pages long. It was not very thorough. These other reports, this is by the Federal Experts Security something. These other reports were much more in depth,
Uh-huh.
and they were mostly comprised of like different experts, advisory bodies, things like that, and also consulted like representatives from labs,
Right.
other stakeholders, and as far as I know, for safety in particular, I'm trying to think about specific actions that have been taken. I
Just
know.
like reducing human error, things that are focused mainly on reducing human error, I guess.
Yeah. What's coming to mind right now are not specific things that the select agent program has taken, but actually like pushback. So I know, this is not necessarily pushback from the select agent program itself, but I forget which one of these reports, but one of these two reports, there's actually like a section where they said, yeah, we think the select agent regulations are actually pretty good, and that any kind of actions were due to non-compliance with the regulations rather than regulations themselves, and so we think that we need to change them. And also,